It's showing some wear right there. Oh yeah, look at that. Well, you guys seen that. That's a new one for me. And we're gonna get to the bottom of it. Welcome to the channel, guys. Today I want to take you along to tear down this T56 6-speed. This is out of a Z06 Corvette. They're a little different than your normal T56 from like a Cobra or a Camaro. For the most part, internally, they are the same. It's just the outside is a little different. Although I'm showing many of the steps, this isn't a how-to video on how to rebuild it, but it's a good thing to refer to like a user manual. I'm also going to be sharing some tips and tricks. But the first thing I always like to do with the transmission is spin the input and the output. And in this case, right here, it's binding up. So something's going on the inside. Well, I got a T56 in here. Just want to take the opportunity and make a teardown video. The owner complained of a noise in 5th, 6th gear. I already suspect that it has a worn main shaft and the gear is most likely loose on the splines. Honestly, it could be anything. And we're definitely gonna find out if what I suspected was true or not. And it's always good to drain the oil before we stand this thing up so we don't make a mess everywhere. I also prefer that if you bring me your transmission, you drain it first, but it's always good to see the color, see the condition of the oil. Here I am removing the front bolts because once we stand this thing up, in order to get the case off, we're gonna have to take those bolts out. So I always take them out first before I set it up here. Now before we pop this off, I just want to make a note that there is pry points on this case, so you do not ruin the mating surfaces. They're specifically there to put a screwdriver or a pry bar under it to get off the tail housing. And at first glance, so far so good. These gears look like they were well lubricated. They look beautiful, intact. But then I saw the magnet, and that is just not normal break-in material. They put magnets in these cases to catch all the break-in material from the factory so you don't ruin your bearings, but there's some pretty big chunks on that magnet. So let's dig in a little deeper here. And to start off, we got a snap ring that holds in this bearing, and there is a spacer on the top and the bottom of that bearing. These aren't my favorite set of snap ring pliers. I misplaced my favorite set, so it could be a little struggle getting these off. Gotta have the right tool for the job, guys. And then one more snap ring that holds the fork onto the rail. And once that's off, we can pull off this whole assembly. We got a thrust washer and then our reverse gear, a wave spring, our synchro, and then our needle bearing that rides between the main shaft and the gear. And then what I'm prying up right now is a plastic spacer. And then we got another fun snap ring. That's not good. She is stuck on there. And that thing is on there. There we go. Popped it out. You guys know that saying, you're one broken bolt away from ruining your day or something like that. Transmissions, it's snap rings. You're one snap ring away from this thing taking you all day just to get this one little part off. There it is. My God. Sometimes when these snap rings are stuck on there, you have to overstretch them, but just be aware you cannot reuse this snap ring or it will fail. I guarantee you, these parts are cheap. Replace your snap rings. I actually had one that came in and it was stuck in reverse. This shift rail and fork right here, that snap ring holds that assembly together. So basically that overstretched snap ring came off when they put it in reverse, and they couldn't get it out of reverse because the rail will just slide in and out of the fork and it wasn't able to disengage. See how much trouble this wants to give me to come off. All right. All right, now we can get a good look at this 5th 6 and see if my diagnosis from his explanation of what was going on is in fact true or not. Now, I've explained how these splines wear out on these main shafts, causing the 5th 6th gear assembly to rattle, growl, vibrate, make noise. And let's see if there's any play between the gear and the shaft. Oh yeah, look at that. You can almost see it on the gear. Be able to get a better shot of that once I take this gear off. Now the one good thing about this issue is I don't have to take this out and put it in the press. I can just pull this gear assembly off. It's smooth, 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 and then you see that change in color. Doesn't look too bad, but it is. Then I got another snap ring right here that we got to take out. And this whole assembly should come out in one piece. And there's most of it. And then we got our 6th. There's a little spacer here and a needle bearing in between, and something fell out as I pulled that up. There's another spacer here, but there's something different about this. If I remember correctly, there should be a kind of like a race or spacer to make this surface smooth for that 6th gear to ride on. I gotta double check the manual on that one, but I think what they did was added more meat on 6th gear, so that spacer is no longer needed. So it's always a good idea to refer to the manual. You can take pictures of everything that you're doing, but if it's missing something from the previous guy that didn't put it back in, then you're never gonna know. You might think something doesn't fit right, and you'll kind of get an idea, but you won't really know what you're missing. So it's always good to refer to the manual and just, you know, check it out. I'll put the link below. Just by the looks of all this material, I mean, that looks like chunks of gear to me. That looks like maybe a bearing, some rollers in there. All right, moving down to the top of the case, we got our reverse lockout. Just pops right off. And then our cover here, we'll be able to see our offset lever. And with this T56, they kind of changed the setup. There should be a spring and a ball behind that offset lever on the bottom. But like I said, they redesigned it a little bit, so it's a little different than a normal Corvette T56. That roll pin just gets driven down until it stops, and we'll be able to get the roll pin out once we pull the case up. Now to the last piece to get this case off is the shift lever guide bolts. I always heat them up because they put red Loctite in here from the factory. And I give it usually about a minute of heat, not too much, but definitely gonna use them because sometimes they're on there pretty tight. And there's a shot of the Loctite spilling out of there. And I always like to mark one, even though they're the same, I just like to put them in the same spot. And then again, we have our pry points. Break the seal. Like I mentioned before, when you're pulling this up, just be aware, because once you get that offset lever above the rail, that ball and spring will pop out. But they redesigned this one, so all I have to worry about is that roll pin in there. I always like to grab it before I get the case all the way up, just so I don't lose it. And some more trash and metal debris at the bottom there. And you can really see how all those metal shavings just get everywhere. I'm telling you, those magnets save the life of these transmissions. Even when something major goes wrong, you know, they can help not destroy the rest of it. You can just see all that metal everywhere. Usually at this point, we see the damage, we see what happened. Like I was saying before, it looks like that is gear teeth on that magnet. I pulled a little bit out of that puddle of oil that was in the case, and kind of looks like little roller bearings. So I suspect that when we pull apart this main shaft, one of those needle bearings that's under the gears ate itself apart. Why? I don't know. This is just very interesting that we've gotten this far and we haven't seen anything to cause all that material. Unless I missed something and it completely shredded itself to pieces and it made it look like it wasn't even there in the first place. We got our shift rail, just pops right out. And our counter shaft next, just gotta lift up on the main shaft assembly and it'll pop out. And then our forks, our rail, and our main shaft come out in one take. And then our input shaft. There is the whole pile of metal shavings and chunks everywhere. And now we move on to the main shaft, and hopefully our problem lies in there. And I think I found the problem. Check out this. So if we notice the play on these gears, I mean, they're pretty solid and tight on there. There's no movement. But if we come to first, this thing is gone. Loosey-goosey right there. That needle bearing is definitely gone under there. This should not move around like this. So what I look for is obviously these teeth, the gear teeth we'll call them, and the wear and the pattern and, you know, the finish on the edge and the color. Like, these gears look great, except for Shelby's hair. It always seems to get on my transmissions. Yeah. Let me zoom in for you. And we got a little bit of a burr going on right here. If we compare that one to the ear on the Synchro for first, you can tell the difference. Definitely hitting it hard, and it's showing some wear right there. Also, not just these teeth, but you want to look at the dog teeth. Now this is where this slider gear engages the actual gear itself. These two teeth mesh, there's a synchronizer in between. That synchro slows down this gear so you can make a gear change. The shift fork rides on this slider and you can shift gears back and forth. Usually when the synchronizer is going out, you will see these teeth completely flattened out and just there's a huge burr and a lip on it, and that means that this thing's been grinded. Also, you want to look at the gap. This is probably a bad example, but just the way it's sitting, this would indicate that there's no material left on this synchronizer. That would indicate this gap right here between the gear and the synchro would indicate a healthy synchronizer, more or less, but that just shows you there's actual material on the tapered synchronizer. I hope you guys got all that. I'm not the greatest at explaining things, but there's also a lot going on with the transmission if it's the first time you see it. So this little O-ring here, that just holds the bearing on the main shaft while you're assembling. Next issue, this bearing should just come right off, but it is seized on there. And I suspect it has something to do with why that failed. And this is the setup to press this off. I always make sure I get as much teeth on my bearing splitter as I can and make sure that none of them are, you know, halfway on there or the edge is touching, because they can crack pretty easily if you don't have it set up right. So just beware of that. Sometimes the press alone is not enough when you have all these parts damaged. You got to put a little heat in it. And look at that, just a little heat was able to free it up. I don't normally take hammers to stuff, but given that this bearing and this gear is trash, it really doesn't matter at this point. I mean, look at this thing. And here's the big reveal of what we got going on. I mean, check out the inside of this thing. It's even worse than the bearing was. The whole thrust surface is messed up. The cone has a big lip on it. And then look at the inside of the cone. It's like all rounded out. This thing got smashed into this assembly. And I honestly don't know how this thing was even running or how I wasn't told of a complaint in first gear. We got this spacer that's stuck on the shaft. The whole synchro assembly is stuck on the shaft. It ain't looking good. And my main concern at this point is, am I going to be able to get the second and third gear off? Obviously, the main shaft and first gear and that assembly is trash, but you know, those gears are still good. So I'm gonna try to see if I can get them off. And check out that snap ring in there. It's in multiple pieces. All right, so our next move is to press second gear off this way. And I don't think that's gonna happen without some intervention of a cutoff wheel or a grinder. With that snap ring jammed in there, even though it's in pieces, it's still in the groove. So I really don't think this is gonna come off, but we're about to find out. Yep, as I thought. That ain't going nowhere. So before I cut up this slider and shaft, I just wanted to see if I could possibly get my bearing splitter in there and get third gear off first and then figure out second gear later. But I came to the conclusion that I couldn't get a good grab on the gear and I didn't want to take the chance at destroying it or damaging it in any way. So I ended up getting a grinder out. Didn't think the slider was going to be able to be saved, but I was able to get the snap ring out of there, just cut it out into pieces, and hopefully it'll break loose, and we're good. This bearing is sacrificial. In order to get all this stuff off, you're gonna have to destroy this bearing. I know I don't like doing it that way. Over the years here, trying to get this bearing off, I've never successfully gotten off. I've tried pullers, I've tried bearing splitters. Every time it bends the cage and I can't get it off. There's just nothing for any tool to grab behind here. So you gotta cut the cage and then you'll be able to pull off the inner part of the bearing. A lot of the snap rings on this thing are tight. There we go. Our synchro assembly here. And thankfully the third gear and 3/4 slider assembly came off like butter. And here is our disassembled main shaft. And let me tell you what a pain all that was to get off. Took me a lot of extra time, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. I also have an extra 1/2 slider on the shelf. I just want to show you guys the difference of what a good one looks like. There's that raised inner edge, that thrust surface, and that's what we got going on. That thing just smushed. So why did this fail? I honestly can't tell you. It's not like it was ran low on oil. All the gears look great. There's no hot spots, none of that stuff. Usually you can tell right away if it was ran with no oil. I would almost think that somebody took it apart, tried to fix it, and they didn't put something back correctly, but the fact that all the snap rings were in there solid and giving me a hard time, I can pretty much take that out of the equation. And the only thing I can think of is maybe they shifted into first instead of third and everything got jammed up right there. I really don't know, but if you guys have any ideas, drop a comment. Now, why can't I rebuild it? It's the simple fact that nobody remanufactures this particular gear set. Now, this T56 is out of a Z06 2005 Z51 Corvette. Now, the Z51 came with a different ratio gear set, and it turns out that Tremec no longer manufactures that gear, and it's been on back order for the past few years. So the only way you could repair this transmission is if somebody sold the parts online from a parted out T56, you got lucky, you found the gear, and you were able to rebuild it that way. Or what I tell most people is find another core transmission, buy that transmission, we'll make one out of two transmissions, take the good parts and make up one. It may not be very cost effective to do it that way, but you may not have any other options. It's unfortunate, I'm not familiar with the Corvette stuff, but this version of a T56 is different from like a Camaro or a GTO or a Firebird because of the setup, the transaxle setup on the Corvette. So I don't know if there's any like direct replacement transmissions that another company makes that you can put into your Corvette. Now let's say I go on eBay and I find the gear that I'm looking for. What I've learned and what I've been taught is that putting a used gear from another transmission on top of another used gear from another transmission, and when you go and mix and match gears, that's when they can get unhappy, they can cause noise, and they can prematurely fail. So I really like to keep all the gears together and don't really like doing a Frankenstein transmission. But if that's the only option you have, then that's what we got to do. Like in this situation, first gear went out, so I would have to put a used gear on top of that counter shaft gear. So at this point, you might as well replace them all, except for, you know, fifth, sixth, because they're separate from the counter shaft. Those will be okay. And you might be asking, well, why do I have to replace all of them if just one of them went out? Well, that's the thing. You have two shafts. You have the counter shaft, which is a one-piece, all four gears, one-piece shaft, and then the main shaft, it'll say another four gears, are separate. They all float. So like in this situation, first gear went out, so I would have to put a used gear on top of that counter shaft. I would feel more comfortable if Tremec made these gears, similar materials, similar specs, and you know, it's the OE manufacturer. Now in today's age, everything's made overseas, Korea, China, Taiwan. They probably don't have the same materials, tooling, and specs as the original gears. They can get them pretty close, but now you're mixing a different manufacturer's gear with an OE gear, and that's taking a bigger chance than getting one from Tremec. As of now, until we find a gear, somebody makes a gear, this thing is going to sit in a parts bin until that time comes, if it ever comes. I've got a TKO 600 sitting under my bench with a busted third gear on both shafts, and it's gonna sit there until somebody decides to make a gear, until somebody parts out a transmission and there's a good gear set that I can put in it. You can buy rebuild kits for them, but you can't buy gears. So it is what it is. It's not the greatest thing for business sometimes, but not much we can do about it. I don't know if you guys seen my T5 rebuild videos, but I do a lot of T5s. One being I work on a lot of Fox bodies, and two, parts are available. There are companies out there that actually remanufacture gears. It's great that those gear sets are out there and you can rebuild those T5s from top to bottom. not just bearings and synchros and small parts, but the gears. It would be great if Tremec could, you know, get it together, pump out some gears. The situation is just a bummer, honestly, but hopefully one day we'll be able to put this back together and I'll make a video on it. But until then, thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you on the next one.